In the quiet and misty valley of Wainuiomata, New Zealand, there sits a suburb that looks entirely normal on the surface. It is a place of modest homes and green hills where the mist rolls down from the Rimutaka ranges like a heavy, suffocating blanket. But in October of the year 2007, this quiet community became the setting for one of the most harrowing events in modern history. The events that transpired behind the curtains of a seemingly ordinary home were not driven by malice or hatred, but by a terrifying excess of love and belief. It was here that a young mother named Janet Moses would lose her life in a desperate attempt to save her soul from forces her family believed were purely demonic. Janet Moses was a 22-year-old mother of 2 children, and she was known for her bright smile and her shy but loving nature. She lived a life that was deeply connected to her extended family, or Wainuiomata, as it is known in the indigenous Maori culture of New Zealand. Her family was close-knit and supportive, but they were also grieving the recent loss of their matriarch. The death of Janet Moses' grandmother had left a gaping void in the family structure, creating a vulnerability that something darker would soon exploit. The atmosphere within the family was heavy with sorrow and confusion as they struggled to navigate a world without their guiding light. This grief would soon curdle into paranoia. The trouble began innocuously enough with the theft of a concrete statue from a local establishment known as the Greystone Pub. The statue depicted a lion, and it was taken as a prank by a family member. But its arrival at the home of Janet Moses' aunt seemed to trigger a cascade of inexplicable events. The family began to notice strange occurrences and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to radiate from the stolen object. They whispered that the stone lion was not merely a garden ornament, but a vessel for a malevolent spirit. The psychological weight of the theft, combined with their raw grief, created a fertile ground for mass hysteria to take root and blossom into something truly terrifying. Janice, the sister of Janet, was the first to exhibit signs that the family interpreted as spiritual possession. She began to speak in strange tongues, and her behavior became erratic and frightening to those around her. The family elders, deeply rooted in their cultural beliefs, consulted a tohunga, or traditional healer. But the situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. The belief that a makutu, or curse, had been placed upon the family began to spread like a contagion from one mind to the next. The fear was palpable, and it was not long before the focus of this spiritual panic shifted from Janice to the quiet and vulnerable Janet Moses, who was struggling with her own internal demons. As the days in October progressed, the family home became a fortress against the outside world. The curtains were drawn tight to block out the sunlight, and the doors were locked to keep the perceived evil contained within. More than a dozen family members including young children, crowded into the living space, creating a pressure cooker of emotion and fear. Sleep became a luxury that no one could afford, as they kept a constant vigil against the spirits they believed were tormenting them. The air in the house grew stale and thick with the scent of fear and sweat as the temperature of their collective anxiety continued to rise without any release. Janet Moses began to show signs of extreme distress that the family interpreted as the makutu taking hold of her body and mind. She would oscillate between periods of catatonic silence and wild thrashing that required physical restraint. The family, convinced that they were witnessing a battle for her very soul, decided that an intervention was necessary. They did not call for medical assistance or psychiatric help because they did not see her condition as a medical issue. To them, this was a spiritual war, and it required spiritual weapons to fight it. They believed that the only way to save Janet was to expel the demon that had consumed her. The ritual began on a Sunday and would continue for 3 agonizing days and nights without pause. The family formed a circle around Janet, chanting prayers and incantations in a rhythmic drone that induced a trance-like state in everyone present. They believed that water was the purifying element that could wash away the curse. So they began to use it in copious amounts. At first, it was simply sprinkling water and blessing the room. But as the hysteria deepened, the methods became more extreme. The sound of running water became the constant soundtrack to the horror unfolding in the living room, drowning out the rational world outside. The sheer number of people crammed into the small suburban house contributed to a sense of unreality and shared delusion. The lack of sleep and the constant chanting created a collective psychosis where reality warped and twisted. Family members reported seeing Janet's eyes change color and her face morph into the visage of the stone lion statue. They claimed she spoke in a demonic voice that was not her own, taunting them and threatening their lives. This confirmation bias fueled their resolve to continue the exorcism at any cost, believing that stopping would mean surrendering Janet to eternal damnation. As the ritual entered its second day, the use of water intensified into a form of torture that the family viewed as cleansing. Janet was forced to shower for hours under cold water, while family members scrubbed her raw, trying to wash away the makutu. Her eyes were flushed with water to cleanse her vision, and water was forced into her mouth to cleanse her spirit. The physical toll on her small body was immense, but the family interpreted her struggles and cries of pain as the demon fighting back. Every gasp for air was seen as the spirit resisting the holy cleansing, giving them more reason to push harder. The carpet in the living room became sodden with water, turning the floor into a swamp of damp misery. Furniture was pushed against the walls, to make room for the mattress, where Janet lay surrounded by her chanting relatives. The humidity in the room rose, causing condensation to run down the windows like tears. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies became overpowering. Yet, in their state of heightened religious fervor, the family noticed none of this. Their entire universe had shrunk to the figure of Janet Moses, writhing on the wet mattress. Outside the walls of the house, the suburb of Wainuiomata continued its daily routine, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding nearby. Neighbors walked their dogs, and children played in the street, while just meters away, a young woman was being slowly drowned by the people who loved her most. The juxtaposition of the mundane suburban life outside and the medieval horror inside serves as a chilling reminder of how thin the veil of civilization truly is. The isolation was absolute, despite the physical proximity to the rest of the world. The family had severed all ties with reality. By the third day, Janet was exhausted, and her body was beginning to shut down from the relentless physical assault. She had been deprived of sleep and food, and subjected to constant waterboarding, disguised as a blessing. Her skin was pale and wrinkled from the constant immersion, and her eyes were bloodshot and swollen. Yet the family did not see a dying woman. They see a battlefield where the forces of light were slowly winning against the dark. They believed that her weakness was a sign that the demon was losing its grip, and they redoubled their efforts to finish the job. The family patriarch and other senior members took turns restraining Janet and pouring water over her face. They used cups and bowls, and eventually a hose, to ensure a constant flow of the cleansing liquid. The chanting reached a fever pitch, creating a wall of sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Janet's struggles became weaker, and her cries turned to whimpers. But the family interpreted this as the demon trying to trick them into showing mercy. They had convinced themselves that the entity inside her was a master of deception, and they could not afford to be fooled. The psychological state of the group is what experts would later describe as folie à deux, or shared madness on a massive scale. The boundaries between individual identities dissolved, and they became a single organism driven by a singular purpose. Critical thinking had been completely abandoned in favor of groupthink and religious hysteria. Even those who had moments of doubt were quickly silenced by the conviction of the others. To question the ritual was to align oneself with the demon, and no one wanted to be an agent of evil in the eyes of their Wainuiomata. The climax of the tragedy occurred when the family decided that the final cleansing required a massive volume of water to flush out the last remnants of the curse. Janet was held down while water was poured directly into her throat and nose, preventing her from breathing. Her body convulsed in a desperate attempt to find oxygen, but the hands holding her down were firm and unyielding. They believed they were drowning the demon, not the daughter. In their eyes, every convulsion was the death throe of the makutu, and victory was within their grasp. Suddenly, the struggling ceased, and Janet went limp in the arms of her family. A silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the dripping of water. The family did not immediately realize that she had died. In their delusion, they believed that she had finally entered a peaceful sleep after the demon had been expelled. They laid her body out on the bed and dried her off, speaking in hushed tones about the success of the ceremony. They believed they had saved her and that she would wake up cured and grateful. For several hours, the family watched over the corpse of Janet Moses, waiting for her to awaken from her slumber. They prayed and sang songs of thanksgiving, oblivious to the fact that her chest was not rising and her skin was turning cold. It was only when the rigor of death began to set in that the bubble of their delusion began to burst. Panic slowly replaced the religious ecstasy as the reality of what had happened began to seep into their consciousness. The demon may have been gone, but Janet was gone with it. When the police were finally called, the scene they encountered was one of utter devastation and confusion. The officers stepped into a house that reeked of stale water and death. They found the carpet squelching under their boots and the walls dripping with moisture. The family members were in a state of shock, many of them still chanting or rocking back and forth. The transition from the spiritual realm back to the legal reality was jarring and violent. The people who had just been warriors of light were now suspects in a homicide investigation. The autopsy revealed the brutal physical truth behind the spiritual narrative. Janet Moses had died from drowning. Her lungs were filled with fluid, and her body bore the marks of the struggle. There were bruises on her arms and legs where she had been restrained, and injuries to her eyes from the constant flushing. The report painted a picture of a prolonged and painful death that stood in stark contrast to the family's belief that they were helping her. It was a medical fact that shattered the last remnants of their justification. The investigation that followed was complex and sensitive given the cultural dimensions of the case. The police had to navigate the delicate line between respecting Maori beliefs and enforcing the law. The term makutu was discussed in courtrooms and legal chambers as prosecutors tried to understand the mindset of the accused. 5 members of the family, including aunts and uncles, were charged with manslaughter. The legal system was faced with the difficult task of judging actions that were motivated by love, but resulted in death. During the trial, the details of the ceremony were laid bare for the public to see, shocking the nation of New Zealand. Witnesses described the chanting, the water, and the stone lion statue that had started it all. The defense argued that the family members were in a state of dissociation and did not understand the consequences of their actions. They painted a picture of a family under siege by their own beliefs, victims of a collective mental breakdown. The prosecution, however, argued that religious belief did not excuse the taking of a human life. The concept of consent was also central to the trial. The defense suggested that Janet had initially consented to the makutu lifting and had been an active participant in the ritual. However, as the ceremony went on and her condition deteriorated, her ability to consent vanished. The court had to determine at what point the ritual crossed the line from a voluntary religious ceremony to a criminal assault. It was a gray area that highlighted the dangers of unregulated spiritual practices performed by untrained individuals. The trial of the family members was an emotional ordeal for everyone involved. The accused wept in the dock as they listened to the evidence of how they had killed their beloved niece and cousin. They maintained that they never intended to harm her and that they were only trying to save her from a fate worse than death. The tragedy of the situation was that they were simultaneously the killers and the grieving family. There was no villain in the traditional sense, only a group of people who had lost their way in the dark. The verdict came back as guilty of manslaughter for the 5 family members. The judge acknowledged the unique circumstances of the case, noting that it was a tragedy on all levels. The sentences handed down were relatively light, reflecting the lack of malicious intent. The court recognized that the family would have to live with the guilt of their actions for the rest of their lives, a punishment far greater than any prison term. The legal book was closed, but the story was far from over. The case of Janet Moses sparked a national conversation in New Zealand about the place of traditional beliefs in a modern society. It raised uncomfortable questions about how to handle spiritual crises and the role of mental health services. Many Maori elders spoke out, condemning the actions of the family and stating that what happened in that house was not a true makutu lifting. They argued that the ritual had been corrupted by fear and ignorance, and that true cultural practices would never harm the person being healed. The house in Wainuiomata, where the tragedy took place, stood empty for a time, a silent monument to the horror that had occurred within. The neighbors who had lived so close to the event looked at the property with a mixture of pity and fear. The water that had soaked the floors eventually dried, but the stain on the community remained. It was a reminder that belief is a powerful tool, one that can heal, but also one that can destroy if not tempered with reason. The stone lion statue, the object that had allegedly started the entire chain of events, was returned to the Greystone pub. It sat there as a mundane object of concrete and paint, stripped of the demonic power the family had projected onto it. To the patrons of the pub, it was just a decoration. But to those who knew the story, it was a chilling symbol of how an ordinary object can become the focus of extraordinary madness. The lion stared out, with blank stone eyes, keeping its secrets. Psychologists who studied the case pointed to the extreme stress and grief the family was under as the catalyst for the hysteria. The death of the grandmother had removed the anchor that kept the family grounded, allowing them to drift into the treacherous waters of superstition. The isolation and sleep deprivation acted as accelerants, fueling the fire of their delusion until it consumed them all. It is a terrifying case study in human psychology, showing how quickly rational people can descend into madness when placed in a high-pressure environment. The children of Janet Moses, who were present in the house during the early stages of the exorcism, were left without a mother. They became the silent victims of the tragedy, carrying the legacy of what happened to their family. The community rallied around them, trying to provide the support and stability that had been so violently stripped away. Their future would forever be shadowed by the events of that wet and terrifying October week. Even years later, the story of Janet Moses retains a power to disturb and unsettle. It challenges our understanding of reality and forces us to confront the dark corners of the human mind. It asks us to consider where the line lies between faith and delusion, between healing and harm. The tragedy is not just that a young woman died, but that she died at the hands of those who believed they were saving her. It is the ultimate betrayal of trust, born not of hate, but of a twisted and lethal love. As the mist continues to roll down the hills of Wainuiomata, the memory of Janet Moses lingers like a ghost in the collective consciousness. The suburban street remains quiet, and the houses look the same as they did in 2007. But for those who remember, the air still feels a little heavier, and the shadows a little deeper. The story serves as a grim warning that the most terrifying demons are not the ones that inhabit statues or curses, but the ones that reside within the human mind itself, waiting for the right moment to surface. The legacy of this exorcism tragedy is a permanent scar on the history of New Zealand crime and culture. It is a story that is whispered about in dark rooms, a cautionary tale told to warn of the dangers of obsession. The water that was meant to cleanse brought only death, and the prayers that were meant to save brought only ruin. In the end, there was no demon in the house in Wainuiomata. There was only fear, and fear is the most dangerous spirit of all. Ultimately, the death of Janet Moses forces us to look in the mirror and question the fragility of our own sanity. We like to believe that we are rational beings immune to such hysteria, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. Under the right combination of grief, isolation, and fear, any group of people can be led down a path of destruction. The darkness that consumed the Moses family is not unique to them. It is a dormant force that exists in the periphery of the human experience. The final image that haunts those who know this story is not of a monster or a ghost, but of a young woman lying on a wet mattress, surrounded by her family. It is the image of love distorted into a weapon. It is the silence of the house after the chanting stopped. It is the realization that the true horror was not supernatural, but entirely and devastatingly human. And that is why the story of Janet Moses will never truly fade away. As night falls over the valley, the wind sometimes sounds like a distant chant, and the rain against the window pane taps a frantic rhythm. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the spirits feels thin in Wainuiomata. The tragedy serves as a constant vigil, ensuring that such a darkness is never allowed to take root again. But in the quiet moments when the house settles and the lights flicker, one cannot help but wonder if the fear that drove them mad is still out there waiting for its next invitation.